Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. It's been way too long, especially for those of you who listen to me as a podcast rather than on YouTube or TikTok. It's been months. I've had my short dailies, but I haven't done any of these full-length posts in a really long time. And I'm going to be honest with you. I quit drinking, did the whole rehab thing and all that jazz. And it's affected my writing. You'd think my inner muse is the ghost of Hemingway demanding sacrifices to my liver, but it's been an adjustment. I've made some improvements around here. The time has not been spent in vain. I've added a lot more additional soundproofing to my studio. I actually share this room with 5 chinchillas and 2 guinea pigs, and I know they've made more than a few appearances in my previous recordings, barking for food or running on the wheel or just being happy, active rodents. Not to mention that I also have 2 huskies that you might have heard howling in the distance. They're actually on my shirt. This is Witcher and this is Annie. For my visual audience, you will notice a few changes to my lighting and also a second camera. Which hopefully all of this makes a difference for a more enjoyable experience. I promise that I am going to do my best to try to get back to being consistent with weekly posts. But for now, I'm going to stop rambling and I'm going to just say, let's get on with it. Today, we're going to look at real life versions of classic movie monsters. The Wolfman, the Vampire, the Mummy, and Frankenstein. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And be sure to give us a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Who was the Count of Saint Germain? A vampire? Perhaps even Dracula? Or the wandering Jew Jesus cursed with immortality? Maybe he was an alchemist who discovered the Philosopher's Stone, or simply a wealthy adventurer who could spin a good tale. Voltaire called him, albeit tongue-in-cheek, the man who knows everything and does not die. And Horace Walpole said of him, he sings, plays violin wonderfully, composes, is mad, and not very sensible. Even without mysticism or immortality, the Count was a truly fascinating individual who rubbed elbows with the European elite of the 18th century. He was proficient in multiple languages, including, by some accounts, English, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Chinese, among others. With the ability to speak and write, he composed numerous musical pieces, penned several works of literature, and he even claimed to be able to remove flaws from diamonds and transmutate metals. Yet, he is not a name that comes readily to mind as so much as his contemporaries, like Casanova, Mozart, Voltaire, all of whom he was acquainted with. Over the years, he went by many names before settling upon the Count of Saint Germain in the 1740s. He has been called Prince Rakuzi, Knight Showing, and the Marquis of Montferrat, among others. Yet his true origins are exceedingly murky. Sifting through the truth and the legend is no easy task. In addition to the outlandish claims the Count made about himself, such as being hundreds of years old and knowing the secrets of universal medicine, a comedian in Paris took to impersonating him in salons starting in the late 1740s. It is from here that the link between the Count of Saint Germain and Jesus most likely comes, along with the belief that he is thousands of years old, not just hundreds. Let's start with what we know is true. He first appeared in the public eye in 1743 when he was arrested in London under suspicions of being a spy. Later in that decade after his release, he was employed by King Louis XV of France to perform secret missions in England. By 1760, he took on a similar role with the Hague. In 1762, he was in Russia, where he took part in a conspiracy to place Catherine the Great on the throne. He also advised the commander of the Imperial Russian Army in their war with Turkey, helping lead them to victory. By 1774, he was back in France, where he allegedly warned King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette that the French Revolution would take place in 15 years. Finally, in 1779, he was in Hamburg, Germany, where he took up residence in Castle Enkernförde as a guest to Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. It is here, according to local legend, that he passed away on February 27th, 1784. And did I mention that in almost every part of his life, he looked around the age of 45? Pretty good age, if I do say so myself. Even if this is the full extent of the story, you have a highly eccentric man who came seemingly out of nowhere, who had untold wealth and knowledge and became the advisor to kings and queens throughout Europe. That, of course, is not the full extent of the story. In the Conte de Saint-Germain, The Secret of Kings, it is speculated that the Count was born in the 1690s, the son of Francis Rákóczi II, the Prince of Transylvania. Francis II's first son, Leopold George, was believed to have died at the age of 4, but it is theorized that he lived out his youth in exile to protect him from the Habsburg dynasty. This would account for his wealth and education, although the Count himself made this claim in 1779 to Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. He made a lot of claims throughout his life. At one point, he said he was Simon Wolf, an Alsatian Jew, and at another point, he said he was a Spanish Jesuit named Amer. The Count was as mysterious in life as he is in death. That is, if he's dead, of course. Now, surely if he was around for hundreds of years, someone at some point would recognize him, right? Well, in 1760, Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of King Louis XV, threw a soiree at her home in Paris. Here, Countess von Gregory was astonished when she met the Count of Saint-Germain. She asked him if he had a father who had been in Venice in 1710. He replied, "No, madam. But I myself was living in Venice at the end of the last and beginning of this century. I had the honor of paying you court then." "Forgive me, but that is impossible," the Countess exclaimed. "The Count de Saint-Germain I knew in those days was at least 45 years old, and you, on the outside, are that age at present." Saint-Germain just smiled knowingly. "Madam, I am very old." This, of course, would make the Count almost 100. The puzzled Countess exclaimed, to which the Count said, "That is not impossible." And he went on to outline in detail the prior meeting they had 50 years earlier. Now, the Countess herself was advanced in years and may have had memory issues. But that story, combined with the Count's claims, create an intriguing legend. Despite his reputed death in 1784, Anton Mesmer, the founder of mesmerism, claimed to know Saint Germain the following year. Some even claim that the Count taught Mesmer hypnotism. He was also a representative at a Freemason convention that year. And in fact, according to Alessandro Count de Cagliostro, it was the Count of Saint Germain that founded Freemasonry and initiated him into the rite. According to the memoirs of Albert Van Dam, he met Saint Germain in 1821. He wrote that he called himself Major Fraser, lived alone and never alluded to any family. Moreover, he was lavish with money throughout these, though the source of his fortune remained a mystery to everyone. He possessed a marvelous knowledge of all the countries of Europe at all periods in time. His memory was absolutely incredible. And curiously enough, he often gave his hearers the understanding that he had acquired his learning elsewhere than from books. Many is the time that he told me with a strange smile that he was certain that he had known Nero, had spoken with Dante, and so on. The most recent alleged appearance of the Count of Saint Germain came in 1972 when a man named Richard Chanfray appeared on a French television show, allegedly turning lead into gold on a camp stove. Chanfray was a French visual artist who had a passing resemblance to portraits of the Count of Saint Germain. Much like his 18th century counterpart, he claimed to be immortal and have a strong understanding of alchemy. He also claimed to remember his past lives, which, I mean, if he was immortal, I don't know how exactly that works, but I'm not immortal, so what do I know? In one recollection of a meeting with Richard Chanfray, Spanish reporter Jose Maria Inigo recounted how they had met at Chanfray's home and he sprinkled a powder on a dog's corpse. The dog suddenly came back to life and walked across the room before collapsing again, this time remaining dead. Jose does point out that at no point did he confirm that the dog was truly dead to begin with, or that he doesn't know what the powder was exactly. Chanfray himself sadly died by suicide in 1983. Maybe. If he truly was the immortal Count, then he may have just gone back into hiding. There are claims that Chanfray's body has never been found. Immortal or not, the Count of Saint Germain is a truly fascinating character from history, as was Richard Chanfray. Chanfray grew up in poverty, which led him to becoming a thief, which landed him in prison. It is here that it is suggested that he learned of the Count of Saint Germain and decided to use magic and mysticism to work his way into French high society through divination and psychic readings. Or the alternate theory, of course, is that he was, in fact, the immortal Count, and that he's gone back into hiding, waiting for his moment to return. Much like the story of the Count of Saint Germain, the tale of Kong Tai Djin is a mixture of truth and folklore. Tai Djin was born in 1849 with a rare medical condition known as hypertrichosis, or werewolf syndrome, which is characterized by exceedingly long hair covering part or all of the body. Tai Djin's parents, either out of superstitious fear that their infant child was afflicted by demons or simply not wanting to raise a child with a disability, chose to leave Tai Djin in the woods to die. He was discovered by a Shaolin monk and taken to the Fujian temple, where he was raised and he grew up with with the monks who taught him the Shaolin arts. And he was a natural. He dedicated himself to learning as much as he could. Well, most students would study with one master, learning only 1/10 of the Shaolin arts. Tai Djin studied and mastered all of them. He learned hundreds of empty hand and weapon systems, mastering them and earning himself the title of Su Kong, or Grandmaster. That much of the legend of the Kung Fu werewolf is all allegedly true. One of the most outlandish claims of Su Kong Tai Djin is the time he walked into a meeting to speak with 12 masters. Upon entering, everyone bowed to Tai Djin, and instead of bowing in return, as was the custom, he pulled a knife from his belt and threw it into the ceiling. An assassin who had been hiding in the rafters landed at his feet, a dagger sticking out of his chest. He'd struck him right in the heart. The other masters were astounded. "How did you know?" "When I walked in, I saw 12 people," he said, "but I heard 13 breathing." Tai Djin and his fellow Shaolin monks protected the Fukienese coast from invaders and Japanese pirates. This earned them the love and respect of the people in the area, but it also earned the ire of Qing Wang Shu, the emperor of Peking. He viewed the people's love as a threat to his power, believing that the masters of the Fujian temple would incite an uprising and rebel against the emperor. Wang Shu sent imperial troops to destroy the Fujian temple. In addition to the imperial army and their cannons, he sent Chai Tao Su, the white eyebrow monk, another Shaolin master, to embolden the attacking force. The Fujian monks got advanced warning of the invasion, possibly from the white eyebrow monk himself, and the majority fled to the nearby mountains. They burned their own temple to the ground, and after removing all of the books and valuables. In some versions of the story, Tai Djin single-handedly defended the temple while everyone else fled. The idea was to rebuild the temple at a future date, but that time never came. Now, this story of betrayal and the destruction of the temple parallels the story of the 5 masters of Shaolin, or the 5 elders, as they are sometimes called, which was supposed to have happened 100 to 200 years prior in 1647 or 1732, depending on who's telling the story. The betrayal of Bak Mei, which translates to white eyebrows in Taoism. Incidentally, if you do a Google search on Chai Tao Su, the name given in multiple websites, you get great recipes for almond cookies. And that's the problem with so many of these historic legends. They are a patchwork of tales of the highlights of many stories. What we can say for sure is that Tai Djin was real. He was a grandmaster, and he lived from 1849 until 1929, passing away at the age of 79. Frankenstein's monster isn't real. Obviously, no one has dug up a dead body and resurrected it. Dr. Frankenstein, however, was inspired by real life events. Back in the 17 and 1800s, doctors were only allowed to dissect or otherwise experiment on bodies of criminals put to death by execution. This is how the corpse of George Forrester ended up in the hands of Giovanni Aldini. at the Royal College of Surgeons in London in January 17th, 1803. Forrester was convicted of drowning his wife and child. The evidence was circumstantial and there were no witnesses. Regardless if he was innocent or not, he was hanged for his crimes, and his body was left swinging from the rope for hours in below freezing weather. The point is, he was quite dead. Forrester's body was laid out on a wooden slab and connected to electrodes before an audience of scientists, doctors, and dignitaries. In silence, they watched as Aldini threw a switch, and electric current passed through Forrester's limbs.
Life, do you hear me? Give my creation life!
His face contorted, his eyes opened and closed, his hand lifted in the air, and a fist clenched. It appeared as if he was coming to life right before everyone's eyes. Giovanni Aldini was the nephew of Luigi Galvani, who galvanism was named after. It was Galvani who discovered animal electricity, which he believed was the vital source of life in all organic matter. Aldini's goal was to prove his uncle right. And he was not alone in these beliefs or in the practice of experimentation. In 1818, the same year Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published, similar experiments were done by Dr. Andrew Ewing on the freshly executed body of Matthew Clydesdale in Glasgow, after Clydesdale murdered a 70-year-old man in a drunken rage. Similar to Aldini's experiments, the galvanization of Clydesdale was done in front of a live studio audience. Accounts of the event were described as follows. Perhaps the most dramatic events occurred when the current was applied to the supraorbital nerve and heel. By varying the voltage, most horrible grimaces were exhibited. Rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles united their hideous expression in the murderer's face. At this period, several spectators were forced to leave the apartment from terror or sickness, and one gentleman fainted. In the 1920s and 30s, Sergei Burkonyuka conducted experiments not with electricity, but with what he called the autojector, a heart and lung machine, to revive recently deceased dogs back to life. There is even a video of a decapitated dog's head licking citrus off its nose and reacting to the sound of a hammer banging. I've watched the video. It's a bit disturbing. I've chosen not to include it here. It's a point of controversy as to the validity, and, well, it's out there. If you want those nightmares, let that be on you. The video claims that the head lived for hours connected to the machine, but others say that it only lived for a few minutes. Burkonyuka also claimed to have revived a man who'd recently lost his life by suicide. In the experiments on the deceased man, his chest cavity was opened to reveal his heart starting to beat again. When the man began to moan and sit up, the experiment was promptly shut down. Although none of these experiments resulted in the actual resurrection of a body, except perhaps Burkonyuka's, they contributed to the development of electroconvulsive therapy, defibrillators, and artificial hearts, and, of course, to the legends of the Frankenstein monster. Previously on this channel, I told the story of how John Wilkes Booth allegedly survived capture at Garrett's farm by troopers of the 16th New York Cavalry and went on to survive for several more decades. The official line is that Booth and a conspirator, David Harold, were chased down and cornered on April 26, 1865. Harold surrendered, but Booth did not. The barn was lit ablaze to try to smoke him out, but one soldier, Boston Corbett, slid his pistol between the slats and fired. The bullet severed Booth's spine, paralyzing him from the waist down. He died with his head buried in his hands, muttering to himself, "Useless, useless, useless." But that's not the whole story. Now, at this point, you may be saying to yourself, wait, I thought this was about classic movie monsters, not president's assassins. We did that one. Don't worry, we'll get there. As the story goes, years later, a man named John St. Helen thought he was about to die. He called to his friend and lawyer Phineas Bates, who incidentally is the grandfather of Kathy Bates. St. Helen had a confession to make. He was John Wilkes Booth, and he killed the president. The assassination, he claimed, was orchestrated by Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president. The problem was St. Helen lived. That's embarrassing. Having made his confession, he changed his name again, this time to David E. George, and moved to Enid, Oklahoma. In January 13th, 1903, he took his own life with strychnine. Before his passing, David George reputedly made another confession, this time to a local minister, stating again that he was in fact John Wilkes Booth. No one came to claim the body, so Pennyman's funeral home and furniture store decided, since they had already embalmed him, why let a good corpse go to waste? They put George St. Helen Booth, whatever we want to call him, on display in their window. He became a local attraction. People loved to come and see. Interest in the body was further fueled by newspaper articles about George's confession. Side-by-side comparisons were done between the two mustachioed people, the mummy and Booth. Eventually, Phineas found himself in the area and identified his old friend. He took possession of the body, which he stored in his garage, and Phineas Bates went on to write a book, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, written for the correction of history. He would rent out the mummified corpse of his old friend to circuses and freak shows, or anyone who wanted to display the spectacle, really. After Bates passed in 1923, his widow officially sold Booth's body to a circus owner named William Evans. Some legends claim that the corpse was cursed, not unlike Tutankhamun or Imhotep. Allegedly, all circuses that displayed the body failed in financial ruin. Disregarding the fact that, at this point in the story, we're into the 20s, the Great Depression might ring a bell. Lots of people were financially ruined at that time. In the 1920s, a circus train carrying the mummy derailed, resulting in 8 people dead and several animals. Union veterans of the Civil War stole the corpse from the accident and threatened to hang it. A reward of $1,000 was offered for the body's return, and the thieves returned it, claiming the reward for themselves. Evans was fined at one time for transporting a body without a license, and at another point for teaching false history. In 1931, a team of Chicago doctors used the best forensics of the time to authenticate the mummy, certifying him as John Wilkes Booth. X-rays showed evidence of a neck scar, a broken thumb, and a fractured leg bone, all of which were consistent with injuries Booth had received in life. Mind you, when Booth jumped from the balcony at the Ford's Theater, injuring his leg and yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis," it was his left leg that was injured. Likewise, when Samuel Mudd treated his left leg. But x-rays of the mummy showed an injury to his right leg. Nonetheless, this certified the body in the eyes of the public. In the 1930s, Agnes and Joseph Harkin purchased the mummy for $5,000 and toured the United States with it. In 1937, Jay Gould's $1 Million Circus took possession of the body, and it remained there until the 50s. From there, no one really is sure where the body went. In the 1960s, the Wisconsin Circus World Museum attempted to acquire the mummy from Gould, but they were told that it was no longer in their possession. There are claims in a report from PBS that the body was last seen in the 1970s in a private collection, but these reports are unconfirmed. So, was it Booth's mummy? We may never really know. But when Booth was autopsied, 10 people identified the body. He was identified by his own family and by dental records. The family has agreed to allow the body to be disentombed for DNA testing, but the courts have not allowed it. If there was a government cover-up orchestrated by his own vice president, then any evidence given at that time is fairly irrelevant. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Until next time, I'm Christopher Damian. This is History, Mystery, and the Unexplained. And thank you for listening.